All right. So, hi everyone. I would like to welcome you to this panel for the European Housing Forum conference. We're going to talk today about voices from the field, policies and systems to ensure equitable access to housing and informal settlements in the global south. Achilles Kalergis. I'm an assistant professor at the New School for Social Research and the director of Cities and Migration at the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility. Today, we have with us Matabu Makuta, who is the National Director of Habitat for Humanity Zambia, Raquel Bernardino, who is the Advocacy Coordinator for Habitat for Humanity Brazil, and Farouk Brahima from Slum Dwellers International and the Ghanaian Federation of Slum Dwellers. So today we're going to talk about an important aspect of housing and urbanization in the global south, about informal settlements. A lot of the urbanites living in cities in the global south are residing in informal settlements. This is not a phenomenon that is particular to the global south. This is something that we have seen occurring in cities across the board and across geographic regions. However, there's manifestations of informal settlements that can be very different depending on different contexts. That's why I think today's discussion is going to be very interesting, because we're going to hear about context of informal settlements where urbanization is ongoing still rapidly, but also, such as is the case in Zambia and in Ghana, but also hear about conditions in informal settlements and policies that try to solve issues related with housing in these areas in more urbanized countries, such as the case of Brazil. I wouldn't like to take more time, and I would like to let our speakers discuss the different cases that they're going to bring in today. So I would like to give the floor to Matabu to guide us through her lecture, and then we're going to hear from Raquel and finally from Farouk. Thank you. Matabu, the floor is yours. Not hear you. I don't know why. No. So, given that we have this technical issue, perhaps what we could do is have Raquel start, and then we go to Matabu.
Sure, fine by me.
Excellent.
This technical issues always catch us, right? In this new era. Yeah, so that's not a surprise. Yeah, so let me just tell you a little bit of what we face in terms of housing right now in Brazil. So the key figures that we work on about the scale of the problem in Brazil revolves around 6 million households in what we call a housing deficit. This is not homelessness, this is housing deficit, meaning rent burden or people living, we call asking favors. So people live with other families because they have nowhere else to go, or people living in very, very precarious conditions. So in very, very inadequate conditions. In addition to that, we have 25 million in what we call housing inadequacy. So here I'm talking about uh, building inadequacy, but also lack of infrastructure, lack of water, sanitation, and so forth. So this is basically the picture, the big picture of what we face in Brazil. And in addition to that, we have homelessness and all the issues. We also have a very strong issue of forced evictions in Brazil. So this unfortunately, we don't have official data about that. So there's no, mainly because the public sector and the government itself provokes many of the housing rights violations. So there is really no interest in providing official data and updated and specific data on that matter. So what we do as Habitat Brazil, we have a very strong advocacy program, and we work around four key elements. So the foundation of our work is partnership. So we work very strongly in a number of forums, coalitions, and working together with like-minded organizations, not only within the civil society organizations and social movements and grassroots, but as much as we can, we try to have and to identify and to work together with allies within the justice sector, for example, or with the public ministries and public defenders that still operate in a country where the democratic space is somewhat shrinking with the far right government in place right now. So partnerships and having a partnership with like-minded civil society organizations, but also with allies within the decision-making arena, that's very important to us. The second element, in addition to partnership, would be having data, having evidence, not only to support our proposals in what kind of policy changes we want to see, but also to be able to communicate these messages and to show the kind of issues that we're trying to address and what are the implications and consequences of not having an adequate housing. What does that mean for the health, the education, and so many other rights of people that, well, basically when they lack adequate housing, there's a different number of implications that intersect with other aspects such as health. Very, very clearly in this time of pandemic, we can see how housing is crucial in securing the health of the people in cities and in rural areas as well. The third element would be having a strong communications campaign to build public support, but also to sensitize more and more people and more allies. So here we bring storytelling, and we try to reach the traditional media, but also the alternative media, as we call it here, and navigating through these different ways to communicate in this new era of technology, as we're seeing right now. But also one thing that's very important to us is how do we communicate with people who are illiterate. So there's a whole different way of communicating in with the youth and with the women and people who are unfortunately unable to read and to communicate more traditionally. So this is one thing that we're very concerned about, and how do we communicate our messages. And then we conduct what we call informed dialogues with governments. And here I'm not only talking about executive branches, but yes, of course, executive branches is very important, but also within the legislative branch and within the justice sector, that for us, especially talking about forced evictions, is basically the final word saying, yes, the family will be evicted, or no, the community or the family can stay. So we see the justice sector as a very, very important actor to be engaged. So I thought of bringing just one concrete example on how do we articulate these elements of our advocacy program here at Habitat Brazil. So in the beginning of the pandemic, as I mentioned, we started to see when the safest thing was to stay at home and people were told to stay at home, we were seeing people losing their homes, either through judicial measures or through administrative measures. So, but the municipality telling people to leave, or the private sector reclaiming land and forcibly evicting families and communities from their homes. And in addition to that, we saw, people losing their income and starting to lose their homes as well, because they were unable to pay rent, and they were initiating new informal settlements. So basically new threats of evictions occurring. And basically we initiated what was called the Zero Evictions campaign. And within a very short period of time, we were working together with 100 partners. And as I said, not only partners from the civil society side of it, but also working together with public defenders, public ministries, for instance, the judges for the Association of Judges for the Democracy, and so on. So we really try to be as diverse as possible to really bring together different resources within to work together and to tackle housing injustices. So one of the very important things that we're doing in this campaign is, as I mentioned, there's no official data on evictions and forced evictions. So one of the things that we're doing is that we're collecting information and collaboratively building a national database on forced eviction. So what we're able to show now is that over 20,000 people, 20,000 families, I'm sorry, that's not the same thing. So over 20,000 families have been evicted during the pandemic. So when everyone was told to stay at home, people were being evicted. And in addition to that, we have 120 families who are currently on the verge of losing their homes. So being able to show that and being able to have evidence to show that has gained a lot of attention from mainstream media. So our messages are out there, and instead of focusing on the informality aspects of it and why people should stay or be evicted, we're switching the narrative a little bit and showing why these people are living in these conditions, because basically there's nowhere else to go. So that has been getting a lot of attention. So the combination of our communication strategies and together with the data that we're able to produce, we were able to engage more effectively with governments and with justice sector actors, and finally we were able to influence one Supreme Court decision, one federal law, and 14 local laws to stop forced evictions during the pandemic. Unfortunately, these laws are tied to the time frame of the pandemic. So that means that when the pandemic's over, we're probably going to have a tsunami, a huge wave of evictions or forced evictions. So this is something that we're very concerned about. But we're also very proud of the work that we've been carrying out so far, and very confident that we'll be able to expand the time frame of this protection, especially knowing that over 3 million households in the country lack security of tenure. So that's something that we know that will continue to be an important issue in the country. So that's just some of the initial thoughts that I wanted to share with you. So I think I'll stop here to hear a bit from Matabo.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Let's see if we manage to troubleshoot. We still cannot hear you, unfortunately. Excellent. So let's wait and see. And I don't see Farouk anymore in the picture. So part of the challenges of having an international panel from different locations with different internet connections is that online doesn't necessarily always work. But as we're troubleshooting, I wanted to ask a few questions to Raquel, and there's a few elements. I took some notes about some of the elements that you mentioned. First of all, you provided a very interesting picture of the sorts of coalitions that are created in order to deal with housing insecurity and informal settlements more broadly. And I think this is a very important point. There is a tendency to think in many cases that housing is something that the market should be delivering. And in some cases, housing is something that the government is regulating and should be delivering. In Brazil, there was a quite well-known program called Minha Vida, Minha Casa. Pardon me for my Minha Casa, Minha Vida.
Exactly.
But pardon me for my bad accent. And that was an extensive housing program that provided housing for low-income families. I don't have exact evaluations about the program, but I know that in some cases was more successful than in others. But what you bring in is how housing is also produced through the sort of coalitions that we see in the civil society, coalitions that engage both with the private sector and the governments. Now, a couple of things that I would like to ask you is, you mentioned working under the current Brazilian administration, which from what we've heard seems to be quite hostile to the demands of people living in housing insecurity. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work in this particular context? So how do you do advocacy? How do you reach out when you know that the government is not necessarily a friend of the cause of improving housing, or it's not a priority at this point?
Perhaps I'll just be very brief so we can hear from Farouk and Matabo, because I just realized that they're back and we might be able, so I'll just be very, very brief. So yes, we are in a very, very challenging moment, in a very, very challenging context, not only politically, but also from a socioeconomic perspective as well. So people are devastated from this, from the consequences of the pandemic, and that of course has political implications as well. So right now at the federal government, what we have is really, there's no democratic spaces, and all the institutional spaces have been dismantled and under-resourced for the moment. So that really pushed us to review our advocacy strategy. So what we're doing is going bottom up in a sense. So we are focusing a lot more on the local level, at the municipalities and at the states, and also working sideways within the justice sector. So this is also something that we're doing very strongly. So perhaps we can elaborate a bit more towards, if we do have time for more discussions. But should we hear from our colleagues?
Sounds great. Yes, Matabu, we can still not hear you. It's such a pity, because I would love to hear about the work in Zambia. But if now we can hear you.
You can hear me now.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I don't know why, for some reason, I've been using this same headsets yesterday for this same meeting, but they were working. Anyway, let me quickly say that thank you very much, Rachel, for sharing us with your examples. And I want to start my sharing with saying the informal settlements are a transitory phenomenon, allowing rural migrants short to medium-term housing until eventually moving to formal housing. However, we know that there are a multitude of reasons for our cities to absorb all the migrants into the cities, including many other challenges that include weak land rights, rapid urban growth, especially here in Africa. Zambia is one, by the way, that is in sub-Saharan Africa, that is experiencing 4.2% per annum urbanization rate. So what we have done ourselves as Habitat for Humanity Zambia, we have basically tried to improve policies and systems change to increase access to adequate housing for vulnerable groups in particular, and mostly people living in these informal settlements. How we have done it is by way of, through the implementation of the Global Solid Crowd campaign that was launched in 2016, where we focused on access to land for shelter, promotion of gender equality, and addressing inequitable and enforced laws, policies, and customary practices affecting women's rights to security of tenure and inheritance. And it was through this advocacy campaign that in Zambia, we made position papers for policy change, and we promoted that, and that paved opportunities to dialogue with policymakers. and became partners that are invited to roundtables where policy issues are being discussed. Today, through Habitat Zambia's strong advocacy program, noticeable milestones have been recorded that facilitated more people accessing decent housing, mostly in the areas of acquisition of secure land rights and watch services within the informal settlements, mostly in Lusaka, Kabwe, and Ndola. We therefore believe that the next round of global campaign to be implemented will strengthen further and improve on the solid ground campaign by focusing on improving policy and system change to increase access to adequate housing for people living in informal settlements. In this particular campaign, particular focus will be paid to promoting empowered participation, tackling the contemporary challenges of climate resilience, while ensuring increased and inclusive basic services and freedom from eviction through secure land rights. And we are already awaiting this campaign for us to flagship it here in Zambia to help us further influence change in the policies and systems. Through partnerships and coalitions, we have been able to make these strides. And we have worked with the Mind Like Us, partners like the ministries of housing, infrastructure, and urban development, the Ministry of Water and Sanitation, the UN Habitat, Zambia, and you know very well this is their strongest area of focus here around the fit for purpose land tools that have been developed by GLTN. And we have promoted such models like social tenure domain models to be recognized as continuum of land rights to assist vulnerable communities to have land documents that help them to protect their land and property rights to minimize possible evictions and illegal disinheritance. So our strong partnership as well with the media here in Zambia helped us to also reach millions on policy positions relating to policies and systems that needs to change to allow increased access to decent and affordable housing and basic services. How have we managed to make this change? We have so far been successful to promote the system change for the vulnerable communities living in informal settlement in Magululu, in Kabwe district. This is one of the largest slum or informal settlements here in Zambia, and by the way, the largest in sub-Saharan Africa, where we managed to ensure that the occupancy licenses that gives the sitting tenants the 30-year tenure rights has actually been enabled more in informal settlers to build their resilience around now using their properties, land as an asset, to generate livelihood on income generating activities. And to date, we have also through the donor supported programs have built their resilience and capacitate them with community groomed or home-based methodologies, formation of mobilization of communities, giving them study cycles, approaches, methodologies, savings groups that helps them now to have more resources to acquire these occupancy licenses because they are not free, by the way. However, we have also unlocked the challenge of the system where even those that can afford to apply for such occupancy licenses, the system itself used to take forever and people get demotivated. But by the partnership that the tripartite arrangement that we signed with the Kabwe Municipal Council and the private land surveyor called Zambia Midim Zambia PTY, we have managed to unlock the system to show that this can be done within a record of 3 months. And it has actually proven that. And with this over 400 occupancy licenses to date, since we started this year in April, have been acquired. And this shows that with systems change and policies, more people will benefit to actually increase through their own means to access decent housing. Once they are secured with their land rights, once they now believe in making sure that they can generate livelihood out of their properties. And with this, I think I can just end here for now. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Matabo in her talk mentioned the importance of land rights, but also the importance of services. So another point of entry into the question of housing has to do with access to services. And now we're going to hear from Farouk from Ghana, who's going to discuss a little bit more how this access to services is important for ensuring better housing security. Farouk, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe you can hear me. Yes, in Ghana, the story is not all that different from what my colleagues have said. Clearly, there's a housing crisis globally, and we all are aware that issues of land tenure, issues of planning, issues of financing, issues of technology, and all of that has put a certain group of people in a very disadvantaged situation. Now, we recognized that we had a competitive advantage in producing models and setting precedents rather than attacking policies and systems. So what we set out to do in Ghana from the start was that we came to the recognition that there was a need for a change. Now, government then becomes a partner and the slum dwellers then become partners. One of the things we sought to do in terms of our tools was the issue of data. In fact, at the time, way back in 2000, we keep hearing issues of housing shortages, 1.5 million, 100 million housing shortages. These things do not really make a lot of sense to us on the communities. So when we begin to collect our own set of data and then validate and try to access our own living conditions, we realize that even with or without evictions, our way of life and condition required a certain change. Okay, so we said, how do we approach this change? How do we change our own lives? A citywide strategy became one of the best approaches for bringing lasting and sustainable solutions. Let me share what happened in a community called Ashaiman in one of the municipalities in Ghana. In this community, what we set out to do was to use water, sanitation, and hygiene as an entry point into housing, because the issues of housing are long-term. And so we realized if we had to wait and continue to save and continue to cry and continue to meet, land tenure alone could take forever. And so housing, we said, yes, it's somewhere in the circle. But for now, how do we use housing improvements in terms of water and toilets? Today is World Toilet Day. You know, I'm happy I'm speaking on the World Toilet Day today. And we're trying to value toilets. We have built over 20,000 toilets. And toilet then becomes an entry into tenure security. And so once you want to build a toilet, you would have to engage the municipality around permitting. And the issues of tenure then becomes real. Now look, yes, I want to build a toilet, but I need a permit. And so you need to have numbering, you need to have recognition, you need to have services put into your community. That is one thing that we learned. We also learned somehow that we needed to have the financing. Communities need empowerment. I've heard all this empowerment. SDI, based on our experience, we said, look, let's build an urban poor fund, an international urban poor fund that allows poor people to demonstrate solutions that they profess. And so we use the urban poor fund to demonstrate what we called one household, every house should have a toilet in the city. Now, this toilet per city or per house initiative has been adopted by government. So my point I'm saying is that we try to go down to the communities to make policies bottom up, because we didn't have the competitive skills to go sitting on round tables to discuss with government around policy. But if we co-produce the solution and set the precedent, our government then is today adopted what they call one house, one toilet. And the government tons and tons of thousands of toilets in every community. We feel so relieved in this process. One thing we also realized is that water, sanitation, and hygiene is affected by place, is affected by space, it's affected by income, it's affected by tenure, and it's affected by voice. Now, if you look at these 5 issues that affect water, sanitation, and hygiene, we told ourselves, look, if we, and these are all almost the elements of housing, of good housing. And sometimes what we learned was that there's a need to consciously link housing with these basic services. Many a time we attempt to do just water and sanitation. But for me, water and sanitation is accessed in the housing environment neighborhood. So again, we said, look, rather than go talking about housing, which is contentious, let's begin to talk about improving services, okay, and which is a mobile entitlement. It's a right to drink water, it's a right to shit and shit properly. And so we use the water, sanitation, and hygiene advocacy tools to gain secure tenure and improved housing for the residents. One key point I would want to share before I drop off is the issue of government commitments. In all of these discussions, NGOs and CSOs cannot become prosy governments. We can only partner, we can profess solutions, but the ultimate responsibility relies on our governments. We want to see our governments invest in infrastructure. Until our governments are committed to invest in infrastructure, most of the solutions that we profess in CSO NGOs would at best become pilots. And so again, I'm pushing that when we use the word empowerment, when we use the word community strengthening, SDI, our understanding is that we are looking at data, we are looking at funds, urban poor funds that support people to construct their homes. Just before I drop in 1 minute, let me say again that forced evictions hasn't left anybody. We also experience forced evictions. And one of the surest way, again, that we try to fight forced eviction, we've worked with the UN Habitat, we've worked with Cities Alliance, we've worked with the World Bank, we have used all the geospatial technologies to identify slums and all of that. But we also realized that one key is the partnerships that we forge with all of these coalitions. The reform coalitions that we build in a city for change becomes very, very critical. I would want to end here until questions are thrown to me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring to hearing these stories and open to some questions. And I do have some questions on my own, but I would like to get some of the questions from our audience here. And please feel free to add your questions in the chat box that you have in the upper corner of your screen. I would like to try and bring together some of the points that you mentioned. So we're talking about housing security. We're talking about limiting practices of eviction, which we know that they are not necessarily working and they're not very effective. As Raquel said, you know, we have the creation of new settlements from people that have been evicted from previous areas. We're talking about issues such as land rights, which in the case of sub-Saharan African cities is a very contentious issue, and in the case of Ghana specifically, very much an unresolved issue. If I last time I looked at the worst court cases in Ghana to try and tackle the issue of property rights and unclear property rights, which hasn't happened. And all of you mentioned the notion of coalitions and building together with local partners, sometimes not necessarily partners, but with local groups, right? And as well as internationally working as a network, as Habitat International, as Slum Dwellers International, working with international organizations such as UN Habitat, etc. Right? So I think these are some of the common points. And what really struck me for your presentations is that access to better housing or better housing security is not a one-way road. It can be achieved through many different ways, including, as in the case of Makululu, if I pronounce it correctly, in Zambia, where you do have actual property rights that are given, and this creates improvements. It's very important to understand that these improvements are very much necessary to minimize evictions and also to unlock the investments that people can provide on the ground. And in the case of Ghana, we have access to this sort of housing security through services, right? Through sanitation, through water, etc. So I would like to now go to some of the questions. I have one question that is a little bit technical by Julian Baskin. Farouk, maybe you know the answer to this. He asks, what type of toilets are you building in Ghana? I guess from a technical perspective, because he says this is the technical issue that needs to be cracked. So can you tell us a little bit about the technologies in sanitation that you are using?
Right. Julian, thank you for your question. Like I said, we explored this technology together with a project that we have with the Cities Alliance, the Land Services and Citizenship. The technology we had at the time was this septic tank approach. Now, it didn't work for most of the slum because of the size of the septics. This approach has to do with the digesters. It has an anaerobic process, so it is not the conventional soak-away pit stop we have, but these are more like digesters that we produce with a 5x6 meter approach. So it's not conventional, but it's digester anaerobic systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can also come in there, because as a Habitat for Humanity Zambia as well, we do also to a certain extent provide such services like WASH and vulnerable group housing, and our package usually comes with a pit latrine. So we have been also doing, like Ghana has been doing the pit latrine issues, but we have seen the challenges that comes with that because of the limited space where these informal settlements are. We get to a challenge where there is groundwater contamination that also sometimes end up the outbreaks of cholera issues and many other things. However, we have also piloted a new modern technology as Habitat for Humanity Zambia. I think to date we have done over 15 as a pilot. We call them pore flush toilets. We no longer dig the pit going down into the ground, but we are doing the flush that somehow the water ends up now coming back to be usable, as well as now the sludge being used for some other reason, purposes of fertilizers and manure. So this is one tested pilot that has also been approved by the water authorities and the sanitation authorities here in Zambia, which we think of scaling up for the purposes of also making sure that we don't also create more problems through contaminated water sources.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much for your responses. Another question that I have here is from Amanda Anshiking. She asks if you can elaborate a little bit on the advocacy tactics that you utilize in each different context. And I know you all spoke a little bit about this, but can you tell us a little bit more about it?
If I can go first very quickly, Rachel will have a very tangible for us here in the area where we are currently working and active with the advocacy that is showing some tangible results is where I talked about the community groomed approaches that communities themselves, we empower them with knowledge and skills through methodologies like the study circles, which has the manuals that actually empower them to know, to identify their own problems, being able to also come up with their own solutions, but also now being able to have that confidence and skills to dialogue with the authorities. And I think to date we have so far started that kind of advocacy in action. There have been some dialogues with the municipal council where the representative of these communities go and talk with the authorities, policymakers on the issues that affect their lives, but not only talking about the issues that affect them with their life, but also coming up with solutions. And we have also empowered them with other mechanisms like the savings groups formation, where they come together and form savings groups where they now have the powers also to be able to be responsible citizens, to be able to pay for such services as well, than just demanding without showing the commitment. That's how some of them helped us to unlock the changes in the systems that some of the policymakers are really embracing and mainstreaming as a way of their way of doing business.
Excellent. Thank you. Raquel.
Let me just share with you. I did speak a little bit about the overarching of our approach more generally, but I think there's very, very interesting and very somewhat creative methodologies that we've been developing within our advocacy program at Habitat Brazil. So it's just so fresh in my mind because I am currently on a mission here that in the very north of the country. So perhaps let me just speak a little bit about what are we doing in this kinds of, it's a zero eviction mission. So we identify specific cities in the country that have the most alarming numbers of people living with the threats of evictions, and we do what we call a national mission to visit this specific country and to visit specific cases of people of communities that have been evicted or who are on the very concrete threats of evictions. So the mission consists of 3 moments basically. So we visit the cases to identify and to understand more deeply what's going on in this specific context. We report that to the authorities. So yeah, I was just distracted here a little bit. So we report that. So the outcome of this visit is a report that will be promoted within local government, but also at the national level and that internationally. And then after that, we have a moment that we call a dialogue, a space for dialogue with different stakeholders. So in a public hearing also to be able to strengthen the voice and to make sure that people can communicate with the local, because as I mentioned in the beginning, and Achilles, you followed up on that, our democratic spaces for interaction between civil society and governments is really shrinking right now. So we're trying to push to really to enable those kinds of interactions. So in these kinds of missions, I think we are able to not only learn more of what's going on the ground, but also to shed light and to share through different, well, basically not only through social media and everything, but through formal reports and denouncing what's going on and what kinds of housing rights violations are occurring on the ground, and also to include a moment to dialogue and to have informed conversations with the public authorities here. So this is just one very interesting and effective methodology that we've been applying lately, and I thought it would be interesting to share that with you as well. We call it Misión Denuncia, basically a mission to denounce what's going on. So that's one of the things that we've been doing lately.
Excellent. And to add a little bit to this, I mean, and this is not something that is particular to Brazil. We see this in different cities. New York City has been quite active in trying to make sure that evictions are minimized during the pandemic. We don't know whether there's going to be a tsunami of evictions as well in a city like New York. But I think what is really interesting is that you point out to some of the policy windows that you managed to create with these strategies, right? How do you move from the community to the political and policy sphere, and how do you make these changes in policies? One last question. I don't want to close with this, and so I want to ask you to be brief, but can you tell us a little bit about some of the greatest challenges that you have been experiencing in trying to create policy and systemic change? And Raquel, you did mention working in a difficult environment. Definitely. Matabu, why don't you tell us a little bit about it? And then if we have time, we can ask also Raquel.
Quickly, I think I can mention 2 challenges that we face. You know, in Zambia, we have 2 traditional systems of lantana. We have the and the civil law, where it is very difficult to penetrate through the traditional system of way of doing business. But also the other thing is the changing governments. We have recently now had the new government in place now in August. Sometimes when you think you have made some strides with the current government, then that comes the new authorities completely that you have to start from scratch. I think those are the two challenges here in Zambia.
Mm-hmm. Raquel, very briefly.
Yeah, I think the challenges are very similar here as well. Changing governments and budget cuts is also something that we face very strongly, and conservative responses from the judges and so forth. So I think I'll end here because our time is up. But thank you.
Excellent. So I want to thank you for this very interesting and inspiring talks and presentations. I think to summarize, we see that there's a lot of action coming and starting from the communities, from the civil society, and a lot of this work is getting scaled up. So communities do not work in a space on their own. They create the sort of partnerships that are necessary. They demand accountability from the governments, but also they provide a lot of the solutions that is on the ground. So I think if there's one message to conclude this panel is that housing is an issue of the people, and housing is an issue that can be delivered from the people together with governments, markets, and all the other mechanisms that we have around. But we do need the input of the people first to understand what housing actually represents and means. So Matabu, Raquel, Farouk, unfortunately, due to the internet, is no longer with us. I want to thank you very much for this interesting discussion, and looking forward to hear more initiatives from UN Habitat, from Slum Dwellers International, and other organizations like yours. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.